Okay, hi, welcome. Today we have Barb Roper. She is the Director of Investor Protection for the Consumer Federation of America, also known as the CFA. The CFA is an association of nonprofit consumer organizations that was established in 1968 to advance the consumer interest through research, advocacy, education, and service. In her time at the CFA, Barb has worked on numerous initiatives related to investor protection issues. So welcome, Barb. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Sure, thanks for having me.
It's lovely to have you in our virtual world. So can you begin by giving me a brief history of how you got involved in consumer advocacy and why you believe it's so important?
Sure, so this is actually something that I stumbled into. I was hired by CFA in the mid-1980s to edit their publications. I had a background as a newspaper reporter and working in public information. And when they hired me, they had just gotten funding to do a study on abuses in the financial planning industry. And my boss said, hey, we need to do this study. You've been a reporter. With my supervision, you can do it. So, and it turned out to be a really big deal. Like it was on the Today Show and the Wall Street Journal and, like CBS Evening News. The first press I ever did was CBS Evening News. And so I suddenly became the consumer movement's investor protection person. There hadn't been a lot of attention to those issues, and my boss let me grow that part of the job. And I'm delighted that he did, because it's been a fascinating career, right? You have to have kind of a David and you have to have a David complex, because you're always going up against a better funded industry opponent. You have to be able to tolerate defeat because we don't win a lot. But I think, what drives me is the opportunity to make sure that the average person's voice is heard in the decisions that affect their lives. So for me, it's investor protection issues. CFA works on insurance, we work on food safety and product safety and energy efficiency and telecom policy. And they're very different topics, that they all have that in common, is that our goal is to provide a voice for the average person in policies that affect their pocketbooks or their health and safety.
That's really cool. And I didn't realize how diverse the CFA was. And in a really big group, you have, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of organizations that you work with, correct?
We do. We're a federation of somewhere in the over 250 range.
So yeah, so thanks for that. It's good to know, and it's amazing to me. So 1986, you've seen a lot of really interesting kind of things come through the pike. So, and I'm really passionate about studying conflicts of interest, and the more you study the conflicts, the more you just see them everywhere, particularly in financial services. So my research focuses on financial advisory, which interestingly was kind of your first project, which I also didn't realize. But it's just one example. Can you give a couple recent, maybe specific examples of some conflicts that you guys have been concerned about?
Sure. So I would say it's consistently the case that most financial harm that investors suffer originate with a conflict of interest. So two big examples that I think are helpful to see how consequential this can be is if you look at the last financial crisis, the one that occurred a little over 10 years ago now. It started with faulty mortgage-backed securities, right? And a set of incentives that encouraged the creation of these mortgage-backed securities that then, sort of found their way throughout the financial system. We have an entity in the markets that's supposed to ensure that we see those risks ahead of time. They're called credit rating agencies, and their job is to look at corporations and governments and the debt securities that they issue and evaluate their credit worthiness. And they assign them ratings. So like a AAA rating, it means you're super safe. It's as good as holding cash. And then you get further and further down the alphabet and more and more risk. the last financial crisis, a major cause is that the credit rating agencies assigned, these AAA ratings to extremely risky and opaque mortgage-backed securities. Now, why would they do that? They would do that because they're paid by the people who issue the securities, not by the investors who rely on that information, but by the issuers. And in a competitive marketplace, if you're looking to build market share in a really lucrative business,
Right.
you may be willing to compromise your integrity in order to win that business. And they clearly did. They assigned credit, AAA ratings to securities whose risks they did not understand and could not measure, and they made boatloads of money doing it, and they brought down the financial system.
Yeah, I think a lot about the crisis. I was just chatting with a friend about it this morning, like Lehman Brothers, who was behind a lot of these securities, but Lehman Brothers themselves as an organization was rated like AAA, the equivalent of AAA, until the day they filed bankruptcy, and then they were bankrupt. So it was like, there wasn't even a ratcheting down, just went straight from you're completely safe to, oh my gosh, you're totally in the gutter. So.
Right. And by the way, they didn't get a going concern from the decision from their auditor either until it was too late. And that's the other one. So let's go back another decade to the other major financial crisis that we've gone through, which was the Enron WorldCom accounting scandal. We have a gatekeeper, an auditor. Every public company has to have their financial statements audited by an independent auditor. And it's the auditor's job to ensure that they don't play games with the numbers and that they make those financial statements accurate and reliable. Well, guess who pays the auditor?
Yeah.
The issuer. And again, if it's a big client and it's important to the bottom line of that firm, how willing are they going to be to stand up to management if management tries to game the numbers? And what we found is, not at all willing. And it was, something that we saw at big companies and small companies. So again, we put entities in these important roles that we need them to do well and to do independently. And their entire business model has this huge conflict of interest at the middle of it. And not surprisingly, it doesn't actually end up going well because people do what they're paid to do. It's basic econ 101.
Yep.
And good people find a way to justify doing bad things if the financial incentives reward that.
Yeah, I mean, that effectively brought down Arthur Andersen, yeah?
It did indeed bring down Arthur Andersen. Oh, the other thing that happened as a result of that is regulators are so scared of bringing down the system again. They've acknowledged that they're never going to bring a forceful enforcement action against the accountants. So they have a huge conflict of interest in their business model,
Yeah.
and the assurance that there's only so far regulators are willing to go to disciplines.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so interesting. I used to work as an auditor. I worked for Pete Marwick. As a staff person, you're just sitting there looking at their cash or whatever. And you realize too that there's, in addition to the conflicts, it's very easy for clients to sort of not give you all the stuff that you need, you're not in there and being able to get. So I think the whole business model is really complicated and difficult. So I find it to just be a fascinating case study. And you're right. And so that kind of goes to this sort of next question, this idea about kind of making policy. So, your job and the job of many researchers and others, it's like, what are the problems? Let's identify them. And how do we think a little bit about enforcement or regulation or the combination of the two?
I'm a capitalist.
Sure.
I believe I'm a progressive capitalist, but I'm a capitalist. And the purpose of regulation is to set guidelines. Set guardrails, maybe a better term, around what's permissible in a marketplace. And the question when you're deciding how you're going to regulate is like, what's going to work? And in my experience, I would take restrictions on conflicts without an otherwise strong regulatory standard over a strong regulatory standard that's going to have to work against all of the conflicts of interest. And that's directly relevant to this issue of, broker dealers
Mhm.
regulation. And it has a best interest standard. Brokers are supposed to theoretically do what's best for their customers. It's not defined, but then it continues to allow brokers to create incentives that encourage and reward advice that's not in customers' best interests. So they have to take some steps to mitigate, somehow reduce those conflicts. But we asked them to say, look, could you just say they can't actually create conflicts that wouldn't otherwise exist,
Right.
that encourage doing the wrong thing? And that was a step too far. So you're putting your faith in a vague, undefined best interest standard while continuing to pay people in ways that reward them for doing the wrong thing. I think if you're designing regulations, the best way to attack the issue is to attack the incentives to do the wrong thing. Because I actually think most people will do the right thing if you make it easy for them. But most people aren't going to go out and intentionally harm people's retirement security. They'd rather help. When I look at how you design regulations, my goal is fix the incentives and everything else takes care of itself. But too often what we do is try to micromanage all of the details without fixing the incentives.
When I talk to young advisors who work for some of these conflicted firms, honestly, most of them have no idea that the conflicts even exist. They just know that, hey, this guy trained me to sell this product and I'm going to go sell it. And so I agree with you. It's the majority of them are not in any way trying to be sort of evil. They just want to make money. But of course, the system itself is set up in such a way that it's almost impossible sort of not to do harm and still keep your job in a lot of those places.
I think we're very good at convincing ourselves that what we're doing is okay. I don't think most people set out to do harm. I think they convince themselves that the things they're doing are beneficial, even when they're not, if that's what they're being trained and paid to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's a really, really important point. So we'll wrap up now, but I so appreciate your coming to chat with me about this.